Thank you, Joe, very much. I'm delighted to be here in sunny California. I'll tell you, having come from the blizzard belt in Boston, Massachusetts, I'm sure that rain is much preferable to blizzards. So, and of course it comes from heaven and it produces fertile soil, and that's all to the good. But I was reading in the newspaper today at breakfast that they've just had an election in Portugal. And the article mentioned that 20% of the people in Portugal are illiterate. I imagine most people would read that and say, 20% illiteracy in Portugal? Well, they're a backward country, aren't they? But would you believe this? Let me read you what the Boston Globe said about the illiteracy rate in Boston, Massachusetts, the Athens of America. On March 11th, 1984, the Boston Globe in an editorial stated, about 40% of the city's adult population is believed to be functionally illiterate. 40% of the population of Boston. So Portugal isn't doing badly, is it? As a matter of fact, there are probably many nations that have a higher literacy rate now than ours. And we must ask ourselves, what is happening? Incidentally, there is a difference between simple illiteracy and functional illiteracy. A simple illiterate is someone who never went to school, never had an education. My mother never went to school. She was an immigrant from Europe, and she was an illiterate, and I know what that kind of illiteracy is. That's, the written word is simply inaccessible to an illiterate. But a functional illiterate is someone who has spent as many as 10 to 12 years in school and comes out of it with a reading level so low that they cannot function in our society. As a matter of fact, there are so many of them now in America that we have various national initiatives to do something with this problem. For example, the other day I found this full-page ad in Business Week magazine. Shows a man with a little girl on his knee, and he's supposedly reading to her, and it says, to 27 million Americans, this scene is a fairy tale. That's because 27 million American adults can't read a child's bedtime story, can't read a street sign, can't read, period. Functional illiteracy has become an epidemic that has reached 1 out of 5 American adults. When you think of epidemics, you think of diseases. And here we have an epidemic of functional illiteracy. And then it says, you can change that by joining the fight against illiteracy yourself. It takes no special qualifications. You don't even have to be certified, you see. If you can read, you can tutor or help us in countless other ways. And then they give you a phone number, an 800 number that you can call if you want to become a volunteer against illiteracy. And then there was another full-page ad that I found in a magazine the other day about this new initiative by the television network ABC and PBS, Public Broadcasting. And they say, federal studies estimate that as many as 23 million adult Americans are functionally illiterate. Another 35 million are classified as semi-literate. So there you've already got 58 million people with below average reading skills, far below average. In other words, reading skills that do not enable them to really participate in our high-tech economy. And they state that they are going to help fight adult illiteracy. And they're going to put together something on these stations that are going to, I suppose, help in conquering. It says, we at ABC and PBS have volunteered our time and resources because we believe television's ability to communicate images, ideas, and information can be of great help in conquering illiteracy in America. So there you have it, where we have an epidemic. We've got all kinds of problems, and you might ask yourself, well, why do we have all of these problems? We've got public schools. It's interesting that neither ad mentions schools or teachers. No mention of schools or teachers. A foreigner coming to these shores would assume maybe they don't have public schools in America because they've got all this illiteracy. But we do. We've got public schools in every town in America, free public schools. You don't even have to pay to go to these schools. And if the school is not in your town, they'll put you on a bus and make sure you get there. So we've got the schools, and we've got compulsory school attendance laws that force everyone in America to go to school and get an education. I mean, if your parents don't send you to school, they go to jail. So everyone in America must go to school. It's incredible that there should be this many functional illiterates. And then we've got colleges of education that train our teachers. They are certified. They've got the Good Housekeeping seal of approval. They can't work in a government school unless they are certified. And then, of course, we've got professors of education sitting in graduate schools of education, teaching the teachers, giving out PhDs to everyone else. They're there. And then we have lots of educational research being done. As a matter of fact, more research has been done on the teaching of reading in this country in the last 10 years than probably in the whole of human history. Millions of dollars are being poured into these graduate schools of education, into these labs, education labs. We've got labs now, education labs, where they're trying to find out, how to teach reading. They're still trying to find out how to do it. And, of course, we spend plenty of money on education, don't we? There's no lack of money. I think we spend a little more than Portugal does. As a matter of fact, the budget of the state of California devotes 50% of all of its monies. The state government of California, 50% of its revenues go for education. In some states, it's even higher. So you begin to wonder, what is the problem? Why are we producing so many functional illiterates? Well, if you ask around, ask the professors, ask the teachers, they tell you, you know what the problem is? There's something wrong with American children. Millions of children are being born with these learning defects. There's something wrong with them. They cannot learn. And that's the problem. That's the current wisdom. And if you don't believe it, let me read to you a couple of lines from an article that I recently found in Sky magazine. I do a lot of traveling by air, and Sky magazine is Delta Airlines' own publication. It's a nice, thick, slick magazine that's read by thousands of business executives who crisscross the country, and so they like to make sure that these executives know what's going on. And this lead article was entitled, Dealing with Dyslexia. You see, the reading problem is now called dyslexia. That's the medical term. They all believe now that it's a medical problem. It has nothing to do with education. It's like a disease. You heard, it's an epidemic, so it's a disease. And this is what they say about dyslexia, that it is one of the most misunderstood, misdiagnosed, and underestimated of the learning language disorders. In other words, it's something like AIDS. It's very mysterious. And then they give you a definition of dyslexia. A disorder manifested by difficulty in learning to read despite conventional instruction, adequate intelligence, and socio-cultural opportunity. And the author of this particular article ran across a lady by the name of Elizabeth Fleming, who has 5 dyslexic children. Well, when you have 5 dyslexic children, that makes you an authority on dyslexia, doesn't it? And so she's written a book on the subject. Wouldn't you, if you had 5 dyslexic children? And this is what Mrs. Fleming says about dyslexia. Quote, "I feel that dyslexia is a progressive hereditary trait, one that is increasing in the human population. More and more dyslexics are diagnosed every year. In the United States, an estimated 10% of the children entering kindergarten are being diagnosed dyslexic. It is a phenomenon that has been identified in more than 20 countries. In these days of growing anxiety that modern man may not be able to keep up with the information explosion and technological advances made during this century, I suggest that man need not fear. Perhaps hereditary dyslexics are the new breed of man, an evolutionary species that does not live in a world of up, down, right, left, but rather in the multidimensional or non-dimensional world of space. Can this be called the age of dyslexia?" Unquote. Poor Mrs. Fleming. So now we have a new evolutionary species. Something is happening with the genes, you see. We're getting mutations, genetic mutations. But you know, the interesting thing about these mutations is, in evolution, they teach you that things are supposed to get better and better. In other words, human beings should be getting smarter and smarter. But in this case, they're getting dumber and dumber. That doesn't make sense, according to evolution. And isn't it interesting that evolution has sort of bypassed the Soviet Union? It's only hit America, this new evolutionary species. It's only occurring in the United States and other English-speaking countries where they follow our lead. But in the Soviet Union, everybody learns to read. As a matter of fact, they don't even know about dyslexia in the Soviet Union. Not too long ago, an American team of debaters, university students, went over to Russia. And they debated with young Russians, their equivalents, in the Soviet Union. And PBS did a marvelous documentary of it, showed the students, speaking from the podiums of Soviet universities. And one of the Soviet citizens, listening to the American on the podium, a young man from the University of Pennsylvania, or University of Pittsburgh, who happened to be fluent in Russian, he said, "I recently read in one of your magazines, U.S. News and World Report," apparently, if you remember the Communist Party, they let you read anything that denigrates the United States. And there's so much in our magazines that denigrate the United States that they let some people read those magazines. In any case, he says, "I recently read in U.S. News and World Report that you have 27 million functional illiterates in the United States. How can that be? You're the most advanced nation on earth." Well, our American student up there was totally nonplussed. He didn't know how to answer this. He had no explanation. See, they don't have that sort of thing over there. We have it here. But you see, we know why. We have a problem today, a reading problem. It's no big mystery. Mrs. Fleming may not know the reason, but the reason was given to us as many as 30 years ago. Would you believe it? 30 years ago, we found out what the problem was. Maybe some of you remember. I know some of you are rather young. This goes before you. But in 1955, a man by the name of Dr. Rudolf Flesch published a now famous book entitled Why Johnny Can't Read. I'm sure that most of you have heard of the book. In 1955, over 30 years ago, Why Johnny Can't Read. And in that book, he told the American people for the first time, he said, there's nothing wrong with American children. They don't have any special defects. He says the reason why they're not learning to read is because they're using a new method that is not teaching them to read. A new method that doesn't work. This is what he said. He said the teaching of reading all over the United States, in all the schools, in all the textbooks, is totally wrong and flies in the face of all logic and common sense. And then he went on in his book to explain what had happened. He said that around the early 1930s, the professors of education changed the way children were taught to read in American public schools. He said they threw out the alphabetic phonics method of teaching children to read, and they substituted a new method, a whole word method, a sight word method that would teach children to read English as if it were Chinese. Now, perhaps you don't understand the difference between the two methods. Let me explain. English is an alphabetic writing system. What is an alphabet? An alphabet is a set of letters, symbols, graphic symbols, that stand for something. What do they stand for? Symbols stand for something. The alphabet letters stand for the irreducible speech sounds of the language. The Russian alphabet stands for the irreducible speech sounds of the Russian language. The Hebrew alphabet does the same. The Armenian alphabet does the same, and ours does the same thing. Our letters stand for sounds. They represent sounds. And the way you teach a child to read an alphabetic writing system is that you teach him the letters of the alphabet, and then you teach him the sounds that the letters stand for. And you may teach them individually in isolation. You know, for example, the letter B stands for the sound B. The letter H stands for the sound H. You drill the child in the alphabet sounds, one letter at a time, two letters together. In other words, baby, bi, bo, boo, in combination with vowels, ba, be, bi, ba, ba, in columns. That's the way it was done. And in any country where they use an alphabetic writing system, that's the way they teach the alphabet. If you went to Russia, if you were a little child in Russia, that's how they would teach you the Russian alphabet. When I was learning Hebrew as a youngster, in order to go to Hebrew school, that's the way I learned to read Hebrew. Ba, be, bo. The sounds of the letters. I learned how to read Hebrew. I didn't even understand what I was reading, but I could read it because I knew the sounds that the letters stood for. And the most important thing that you do in teaching a child the alphabet and the alphabetic writing system is to make sure that the child associates the letter with the sound. That's the proper association. Sound symbol. That's the proper association. Well, the professors decided that they would teach children to read English as if it were not an alphabetic writing system, but an ideographic writing system. Now, what's an ideographic writing system? Ideographs are like the Chinese. They're composed of little pictures. They want American children to look at each whole word as if it were a picture. Don't teach them the letters or the sounds of the letters. Teach them to recognize whole words on the basis of what they look like. Configuration or whatever. And that's why children cannot learn to read English, because you cannot teach an alphabetic writing system as if it were an ideographic one. It just doesn't work. You know why? You see, because when you have ideographs, there's enough distinction between them so that perhaps the child can identify something with the little ideograph. But our words, many of our words, are so much alike in configuration that the child just sees letters swimming before his eyes. And before you know it, he begins to exhibit the symptoms of dyslexia. What are the symptoms of dyslexia? Bad spelling, reversal of letters, that sort of thing. And it's only natural that a child would begin to, if the child does not associate the letter with a sound, then he doesn't know what the letters stand for. They don't evoke anything. All he knows is that they are arranged in some arbitrary sequence. And he has to try to remember what that word says. He's got to guess. The sequence of the letters doesn't mean anything to him, because if he has to look at a word as a little picture, well, when you look at a picture, do you look at it from left to right and scan it from left to right to remember every single detail from left to right? No, you look at a picture in any way you want to. The middle, whatever attracts you, right? Whatever strikes you. You look at that picture and you say, gee, I like that sunset. I like the mountains. Or I like the eyes in that portrait. That's what you do. Now you might wonder what kind of men thought up a teaching system of that kind. Well, this new system of teaching was created by America's top professors of education. And they knew that this method would not work. But I'll go into that a little later. I just want to say first that the alphabet was invented about 2,000 years BC. The first form of writing that human beings used was pictography. Now, what is pictography? Well, the cavemen drew pictures on the walls of their caves, and you could look at them and you knew what they meant. You didn't have to go to school to read pictography. In other words, a human being looked like a human being, a tree like a tree, an animal like an animal. That was pictography. They told a story. But as civilization became more complex, the scribes had to depict ideas, actions, things which did not lend themselves to depiction. For example, how would you draw a picture of immediate, or adopt, or teach, or about, or up, or down, inside, out, or together, or result, or expect? How do you draw a picture of expect? You don't. What you do is you create a little picture and you say, that stands for expect. It doesn't look like expect. Nothing you can draw is going to look like expect. But that's how the next form of writing was invented, and they were called ideographs. And the scribes invented thousands and thousands of symbols to stand for each one of these concepts. So that by the time you get up to Egyptian civilization, you have a very complex form of writing called hieroglyphics. Very difficult to learn. Literacy was restricted to a small number of scribes who could master these thousands and thousands of symbols and remember them. And so literacy was very low in those days. But then somebody made a remarkable discovery around 2,000 years BC. Somebody made a remarkable discovery. The discovery was that all of human language, everything we say, is composed of a small number of irreducible speech sounds. Isn't that interesting? The English language has a vocabulary of upwards to 1 million words. And all of those words consist of a small number of irreducible speech sounds. How many sounds, irreducible sounds, do you think there are in the English language? I always ask this question because it's information that every child should have been given in kindergarten, or at least first grade if our schools were doing a decent job. There were only 44 sounds in the entire English language. Only 44 irreducible sounds. Do you realize that everything we say is composed of those 44 sounds in endless combinations? And so the man who made this remarkable discovery said, well, instead of having to memorize thousands and thousands of little symbols, why don't we invent a set of symbols to stand for the speech sounds of the language, and then we will be able to transcribe the spoken word into written form and then translate writing back into the spoken form. And so alphabetic writing was invented, and immediately it swept hieroglyphics off the scene. It was like the invention of the computer. Tremendous advance in learning suddenly took place. The Greeks adopted the alphabet, and you had the Greek dramas and the Greek dialogues. The alphabet didn't quite reach China. Now, I don't know if they knew about the alphabet, but the Chinese clung to their ideographic writing system. They preferred the little picture system. And the Chinese have 50,000 of them. You have to memorize 5,000 of them before you can read a Chinese newspaper. And recently, when they were having the celebration of the United Nations, a TV crew went behind the scenes to take pictures of the translators, because at the UN you have all of these different translators, and they took a picture of a Chinese translator at a Chinese typewriter. How many keys do you think a Chinese typewriter has? 1,000 keys. Well, what system of writing is better? One where you're required to memorize thousands and thousands of little symbols, or only the sounds that 26 letters stand for? Now, it's true we have 44 sounds in our language, and we use a 26 symbol alphabet, 26 letters. How come? Some languages, like Armenian, have one letter for each sound. But we have 26 letters for 44 sounds. How did that happen? Well, the Romans conquered the British Isles, and they imposed the Latin alphabet on the English-speaking people, or whatever they spoke in those days. But in any case, that's how the Latin alphabet was adopted by the English-speaking peoples, and it's worked very well. It's true that some of our letters stand for more than one sound. For example, the letter A, that vowel, stands for long A, short A, which is A. It stands for A, as in father. It stands for O, as in all. It takes a little training. It takes a little more systematic training to train an English-speaking person to read English. Just a little more than necessary with a perfectly consistent alphabet. But it's not impossible. It's not insurmountable. Children have learned to read English very well in this country since its founding and over the centuries. And certainly we've created the world's greatest literature with our English writing system, so it hasn't posed any great problem. We've produced great novels, great plays, works of philosophy, theology. The King James Bible is in English, you know. Another very important thing happened when the alphabet was invented. What suddenly appeared but the Holy Scripture? You see, we had to wait until the alphabet was invented before the Word of God could be put on paper. You see, because how does God communicate with the human race? Not through pictures. God doesn't send us comic books, but through the Word. And what does it say in the Bible? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. There's something very special about the Word, particularly God's Word, because God's Word is very powerful. He communicates with with us with the Word, and we communicate back to God with the Word through prayer. All that God had to say to create the universe was, "Let there be light." And there was light. He didn't have to go to an electrician somewhere, have a blueprint drawn. The power of God's Word. And so, the invention of the alphabet is very crucial to man's spiritual development. Very crucial. Well, along came the progressive educators in the early part of this century who had a different view of God's Word. As a matter of fact, they rejected God's Word. They said it's all mythology. The Bible is a fairy tale, myth, not true. They also believed in evolution. This was the time when evolutionary theory was sweeping the educational world in America. Educators thought, this is it. This is truth. They were also greatly influenced by the new psychology that was being taught in Wilhelm Wundt's laboratory at the University of Leipzig, Germany. You see, Wilhelm Wundt and the other German psychologists decided to apply evolution to the mind, to man's mind. They said, well, if man is an animal, then his mind must have developed from an early animal stage. Now these men, these progressive educators, at the turn of the century, and John Dewey is probably the most illustrious name among them, also believed in socialism. Now why did they believe in socialism? Well, because if you no longer believe in the Bible, you've got to come up with a new explanation for evil. What does the Bible tell us is the origin of evil? Man's sinful nature. We are fallen, and it is man's sinful nature which is the cause of evil. And if we want to be saved from our sins and from our basic evil nature, only God can save us. That's what the Bible tells us. The Bible makes us realize that we are the source of evil. But those who no longer believe in the Bible had to decide that, well, there was some other cause to evil. What was the cause? Well, the usual. Ignorance, poverty, social injustice. Education would get rid of ignorance. Ignorance would get rid of poverty. Poverty would get rid of social injustice. And of course, social injustice was also caused by our horrible economic system. This horrible system of private property and individualism. This system that encouraged this capitalist system that encouraged greed and selfishness. And so they said, we've got to change America from a capitalist society, from an individualistic society, from a believing society, into a new socialist, collectivist, humanist, non-believing society. And in fact, they even created a new religion to replace Christianity called humanism, in which the object of worship is humanity itself. Man becomes the object of worship in humanism. And these men also had a messianic zeal about what they were doing, a messianic mission to change America. Well, they knew that Americans were not going to overthrow their capitalist system, which had given them the highest standard of living in the world. They were not about to get rid of their religions, which they loved. And they were not about to get rid of their individualism. So how were they going to do it? Well, they would take control over public education and do it through the schools using the slow evolutionary Fabian technique. Now, they also realized that they would have to change the curriculum in American schools because, you see, they realized that the curriculum in the schools of the time was sustaining the system we had. It was sustaining individualism. It was sustaining belief in God. It was sustaining the idea of private property. Well, they decided to create a new curriculum that would destroy all of that, undermine all of that. John Dewey worked in his laboratory school at the University of Chicago for over 2 years, creating a new curriculum for the schools of America. And he wrote a book in which all of his ideas were plainly stated, a book entitled School and Society, which to this day is probably read, it is probably required reading by every American teacher who goes to a teacher's college. It's probably one of the books on the required reading list because John Dewey and his book, School and Society, really outlined the curriculum we have today. Well, what was John Dewey's curriculum? He said we have got to downgrade the literacy skills. We've got to downgrade the academic skills. And we've got to emphasize the social skills. You see, if you want children to become socialists, they've got to be engaged in activities, group work, values, if you're going to change their minds, social studies. He says that's where the emphasis has got to be. We've got to de-emphasize linguistic language skills. Why? Because Dewey considered high literacy to be an obstacle to socialism. An obstacle to socialism? Well, because what did high literacy produce? It produced these highly individualistic Americans who could read for themselves, this individual intelligence that could stand on its own feet, that could judge right from wrong, and did not need the advice of an elite. You see, if you're highly literate, you feel pretty confident in your own ability to judge the world, to judge things, to make up your own mind about things. And he said this was not conducive to collectivist control. If you have all of these individualists, they're not going to be easily manipulated. It's very hard to manipulate somebody who can think for himself. You see, you really can't think for yourself until you have a high degree of literacy, because what does high literacy consist of? It consists of knowing language so well that you really have a full command of the tool of thought. Because how do we think? We think in terms of language. Language is the tool of thought. Vocabulary. If you don't have a vocabulary that includes concepts, for example, of freedom, unalienable rights, you're not going to know anything about them, are you? So our vocabulary gives us the means of thinking. Now, in a socialist society, you have an elite at the top that rules over a dumbed-down or malleable mass. And so they decided they had to put their minds to work. They said, look, we've got to give the American people the impression that we are educating their children while at the same time dumbing them down. How are we going to do that? Bit of a problem. But these were the world's leading psychologists. These were men who had done all of their experiments on animals. Edwin L. Thorndike thought he could learn a lot about how children learn by studying chickens. And he became the leading exponent of educational psychology. He was the one who developed the stimulus response technique, which is used to this day, stimulus response. You read today's curricula put out by your state departments of education, they talk about all the stimuli. Now, when you teach a child at home, do you say, I'm going to give you stimuli? Let's give Johnny stimuli today. But the schools talk all about stimuli, response. Thorndike actually preceded Pavlov, and Pavlov says that he owes a great deal to Thorndike, who really started this whole business of conditioning. Well, Thorndike did his experiments on chickens. Pavlov did his experiments with dogs. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Pavlov dog, the conditioned salivating dogs, the conditioning techniques. John B. Watson did his experiments with rats. And Skinner, B.F. Skinner, of course, continued to do his experiments with rats. You see, B.F. Skinner doesn't believe that there's much of a difference between a rat and a human being. Of course, there may not be much of a difference between B.F. Skinner and a rat. But I think there is a considerable difference between human beings and rats. In any case, these men, they had their plan. They knew what to do. We will change the way reading is taught in American schools. We will teach children to read English as if it were an ideographic writing system, like Chinese. Now, did they know that that method would destroy literacy? Of course they did. They discussed it. They admitted it, that it would turn children into word guessers. They even did studies on how could children learn to read by this method. And it's like the joke about where does a gorilla sleep? Wherever he wants to. Well, how does a children learn to recognize words by the whole word method? Which, in whatever way he can. They knew that. You see, they knew that then. Incidentally, we use ideographs and pictographs today a great deal. If you notice, because of the declining literacy in America, more and more ideographs and pictographs are being used. For example, you go to an international airport, or you don't even have to go to an airport. In lots of hotels, if you want to go to the washroom, you have to look for the little picture of the person in pants if you're a male, or you go to the door with the picture of somebody in a dress. But of course, some women wear pants and they may go into the wrong room. It's much more precise if it says men on the door and ladies on the other door. But that's one of the hazards of pictography, is the imprecision. It's a very imprecise way of teaching reading, because language is used to interpret pictographs and ideographs. An example, you know the typical ideograph of the cigarette in the circle with the slash through it. What does it mean? No smoking. It also means thou shalt not smoke. It also means défense de fumer. It means no fumar. It means you may not smoke. In other words, the language is used to interpret the little picture. And we're using more and more of those little pictures and ideographs all the time. The other day, or a couple of months ago in North Carolina, we were driving along the road, and there was a sign, a circle with a question mark in it. And I asked myself, what in blazes does that mean? Does it mean, do you know where you're going? But then I noticed that there was a little arrow underneath that under that sign pointing to the left. So I looked to the left quickly and saw an information booth. You see, that's how they designate information now, with a question mark in a circle. In most places, they will have the ideograph, the idiot graph, with alphabetic writing to make sure that you don't misinterpret it. That helps. But I finally found an airport where they had no alphabetic writing at all ideographs, believe it or not. And this was at the Little Rock, Arkansas airport. I could not believe it. But when I wanted to go to the baggage claim, I had to look for the little picture of the suitcase and follow that. Just follow the suitcase. And then I noticed that when I was being taken back to the airport, I noticed that there were two signs. For departures, they had a picture of an airplane going this way, upward. And for arrivals, they had a picture of an airplane going this way. You got to really think fast, when you're driving and you're saying, where do I go? Is it going up, down? What is it? What does it mean? But we are being trained, we are being prepared for a new form of writing to be used extensively by a dumbed-down population that can't handle alphabetic writing anymore. that can only deal with little pictures. You can't do much thinking with a bunch of little pictures. But this is a planned thing. What I'm telling you is, just as the new method of teaching reading was not devised by some little old lady living in a mobile home in Florida, neither are all these pictographs devised by some recluse somewhere. These things are being done by the world's top designers working in concert with others. In any case, these men devised this new way of teaching reading that would indeed lower literacy. And they weren't ready to get it into the schools until 1930. Now, why did it take that long? Here was John Dewey saying in 1903 and 4, as far back as 1898, that we've got to do something about literacy. But they had to wait until 1930. Why? Because it took that long for the progressive educators who had fanned out from Teachers College, Columbia, and the University of Chicago, had fanned out all over the United States to the graduate schools of education, had attained high positions, sometimes as presidents of universities, and had trained a sufficient number of superintendents so that then they could be placed in all of the school districts of America, or in most of them. The superintendents were heavily indoctrinated by the progressives because every year they had their convention, and I've gone through the entire record. I've read the speeches given at these conventions in the 1920s and the 1930s, and these superintendents were bombarded with an endless indoctrination on the glories and beauties of socialism. And so by the time 1930 came around, the professors had already created the books that were ready to be put in the schools. And the books that were ready were the Dick and Jane readers, produced by William Scott Gray at the University of Chicago, who was the protege of Charles Judd, who had studied at Leipzig and who was the dean. And the reading books by Arthur I. Gates at Teachers College, Columbia, who had been taught by Edward L. Thorndike. He was Thorndike's protege. So this stuff was coming from the very highest levels of American education. Now, it just so happens that in 1929, the professors were warned that their new teaching method would indeed cause reading problems. Who warned them? Well, the person who warned them was Dr. Samuel T. Orton, a neuropathologist at the University of Iowa, who had been dealing with children with reading problems. You see, they had tried out the method experimentally in different places to see how well it worked. And Dr. Orton was dealing with all of these kids with reading problems, and he found out that the genesis of their problem was this new sight reading method. And so he wrote an article that was published in the February 1929 issue of the Journal of Educational Psychology. This was the title of the article: "The Sight Reading Method of Teaching Reading as a Source of Reading Disability." See, they knew about it in 1929. And this is what he said. Dr. Orton said, "I wish to emphasize at the beginning that the strictures which I have to offer here do not apply to the use of the sight method of teaching reading as a whole, but only to its effects on a restricted group of children for whom, as I think we can show, this technique is not only not adapted, but often proves an actual obstacle to reading progress. And moreover, I believe that this group is one of considerable size." Well, he was dealing with a very small sample, but we know today that it's about 1/3 of the student population. 1/3. That's a lot of students, 1/3. And because here, faulty teaching methods may not only prevent the acquisition of academic education by children of average capacity, but may also give rise to far-reaching damage to their emotional life. Well, you couldn't be clearer than that. Now you might say, well, maybe the professors did not read this article. Well, they had to read it because it was published in their own magazine. The Journal of Educational Psychology was the only such journal in the United States, and it was being edited by the very professors who were creating these new teaching techniques. Well, what did they think about Dr. Orton's article? Why did they publish it? Well, I believe they published it because it confirmed to them what they wanted to know, that the method indeed would do what the professors wanted it to do. Maybe he was just a young doctor who didn't know very much, but Dr. Samuel T. Orton went on to become the world's leading expert on dyslexia. The world's leading expert. In fact, there's an organization named after him today called the Orton Dyslexia Society, which deals with the reading problems. He identified them. Now, supposing a drug firm was on the eve of putting out a new drug, issuing a new drug, and they were warned by a distinguished physician that this drug would have deleterious effects on many of its users, do you think that that drug firm in its right mind would proceed to put that drug on the market? I think they would have second thoughts. Now, here was a doctor, a medical doctor, telling these professors that this new teaching method would have harmful effects on a considerable number of youngsters, and they went ahead and put it in the schools. Well, of course, it didn't take very long before the harmful effects became pretty obvious to the American people. As a matter of fact, in April of 1944, Life magazine published a lead article on dyslexia. By then it had become a household word, by 1944. Prior to 1930, nobody had ever heard of dyslexia. And all you have to do is go through the periodical guide, the Guide to Periodical Literature, educational literature, and try to find dyslexia in the index prior to this period. You won't find it. It didn't exist. The disease didn't exist. But this is what they wrote in 1944 about dyslexia. Life magazine. Millions of children in the U.S. suffer from dyslexia, which is the medical term for reading difficulties. It is responsible for about 70% of the school failures in the 6 to 12-year-old age group and handicaps about 15% of all grade school children. Dyslexia may stem from a variety of physical ailments or combination of them. You see, the editors obviously went to the professors and asked them, well, what is causing all this dyslexia? What's causing the problem? Well, these are the causes that the professors gave. They said it is caused by glandular imbalance, heart disease, eye or ear trouble, or from a deep-seated psychological disturbance that blocks a child's ability to learn. Isn't that interesting? Heart disease is a cause of reading difficulties. The article then described the treatment given a young girl afflicted with dyslexia, thyroid treatments, removal of tonsils and adenoids, exercises to strengthen her eye muscles. That's interesting. I suppose they hung little weights on her eyes and had her do exercise until she developed bulging muscles to help her read. Nowhere did they recommend teaching her the alphabet. Wouldn't that have been the simple thing to do? But this was the kind of misinformation, disinformation that was going out to the public. And you can imagine these professors laughing all the way to the bank, because by now they were carrying satchels of royalties money. They were selling these books by the millions. Every school district in America was using them. And they were getting rich in the process while destroying the intellect of millions of children, while crippling them academically, producing children that had to have their tonsils removed to improve their reading. But if heart disease is the cause of the problem, why are they removing her adenoids? That doesn't make sense. But apparently, you see, the editors of Life magazine no more were curious to find out the truth than that poor lady and the gentleman who wrote that article just last October in Sky magazine. She actually thinks that there's a new evolutionary trend going on. Can you believe it? Mutations, genetics, they'll think of anything. And the public seems to just accept it. The public seems to just, swallow this stuff. They're so gullible. And the educators, they've been deceiving the public so long they take it for granted. They don't even, blink an eye when they give out with these stories of how defective American children are with our epidemic. And to prove to you that the method used in the schools is the method devised by these animal trainers or animal training techniques, let me read to you what Professor Walter Dearborn of Harvard University said about how we teach reading. He wrote this in 1940. Now, this comes from the top, Harvard University. You can't get any higher than that. And Walter Dearborn got his PhD from Thorndike at Teachers College. This is what Professor Dearborn wrote. The principle which we have used to explain the acquisition of a sight vocabulary, and if you remember, a sight vocabulary is a list of words that the child has to memorize without knowing the sounds of the letters. The principle is, of course, the one suggested by Pavlov's well-known experiments on the conditioned response. This is as it should be. The basic process involved in conditioning and in learning to read is the same. Well, there you have it. We are teaching children to read English as if they were dogs. Now, I submit that there is a bit of a difference between a dog and a child. You see, when a dog enters the first grade, what does the dog say? Arf, arf, right? And let us assume that that dog is socially promoted right through to the 12th grade and holds out his paw to receive his diploma at graduation. And what does he answer to the professor handing him that diploma? Arf, arf. In 12 years, that poor canine has not learned a single word of English. Isn't that amazing? But a child comes to school at the age of 6, the first grade, with a speaking vocabulary of between 5,000 and 35,000 words. Can you believe it? Can you believe that some children at 6 have a speaking vocabulary of 25,000 words? A minimum of 5,000, they say. Wow, that little kid's an intelligent human being. And the human child starts teaching himself to speak his own language virtually at birth. And so by the time he is 6 years old, he has developed his auditory and verbal skills to such a high degree that he's got a speaking vocabulary of between 5,000 and 35,000 words. And he's done it all by himself. He's literally taught himself to speak his own language all by himself, without the help of Sesame Street, without the help of cartoons. He's a very serious learner. He doesn't go around asking, are there any pictures? Children don't ask for pictures. They are listening very closely and they are learning. Very serious learners, very intelligent. And so when a youngster enters school at 6 years old and has taught himself to speak his own language, he feels pretty confident that he can learn to read. Wouldn't you? I mean, is it more difficult to learn to read than it is to teach yourself to speak your own language at the age of 2 and 3? So let us assume that Johnny is now ready to go to school. And mother sends him to school the first grade. And this is what little Johnny is expected to read. Now, mind you, Johnny comes bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. He feels very intelligent, very smart. And you know how these kids are at 5 and 6. They feel smarter than the adults. And he comes to school, and his teacher has the usual look-say, sight reading, sight vocabulary teaching program, and this is what he's told to read, or to memorize, or to guess. Dick, look, Jane, look, look. See Dick, CC, OC, see Dick, OC Dick, OOO, funny, funny Dick. Well, this kid sits there. He says to he's really at a loss, and he says to himself, gee, either I'm crazy or she's crazy. This is not the way people talk. I mean, he should know. He's taught himself his own language. He's developed his auditory and verbal skills. He has a vocabulary of over 5,000 words. This is not how people talk. Gee, this school is a weird place. But mother has said, now, Johnny, you behave yourself. You do what the teacher tells you to do. Be a good boy. And so Johnny decides, well, he's going to do what he's told to do, and he will behave himself, and he'll try to learn using, maybe there's something to this. But let us assume that Johnny is one of that 1/3 who can't make it because he does not have a photographic memory. His skills are more auditory and verbal than visual. And there are a lot of kids like that, a lot of kids who don't have photographic memories. And so at the end of the first grade, he's having real problems. And mother is called to school and told, Mrs. Jones, Johnny has a reading problem. And by now, Johnny feels pretty awful. I mean, he thinks, well, maybe I'm not as intelligent as I thought I was. Maybe I'm really dumb. And mother is told, Mrs. Jones, Johnny will have to stay behind. And so Johnny stays behind, and by the end of the second year, he isn't doing much better. As a matter of fact, he's even doing worse. And so mother is called to school again and told, Mrs. Jones, Johnny has a learning disability. Johnny has dyslexia. He'll need special education. So he's put into special classes. Mother is frantic. She's saying, what's wrong with my boy? I've given birth to a defective human being. He's got a learning defect. And she goes to doctors, you know, all those doctor's appointments that are made, and he's tested and retested and over-tested. And she's told, well, he's got a real problem, you know, he's got a learning disability, and so he needs all kinds of special training. And by the end of the third grade, things don't get any better, and by then, Johnny is fit to be tied. He is swinging from the rafters. He has become a behavioral problem. And so mother again is called to school and told, Mrs. Jones, Johnny may have minimal brain damage. I'm no kidding. These are the terms that are used by the minimal brain damage. In fact, if Johnny is to remain in school, he will have to take medication. And so they go back to the psychiatrists, and they go through all of the runaround of testing and all of that, and they decide that Johnny will have to take Ritalin if he wants to go to school. And what does Ritalin do? Well, by the fourth grade, Johnny is a regular little zombie, destined to a life as a functional illiterate. Now, you see, why did Johnny become so hyperactive? Why was he such a behavioral problem? Well, this is what that method does. You know, they told us way back, even Life magazine said that something blocks the children's ability to learn. Well, you see, a child comes to school with a tremendous amount of learning energy, and now the system is going to block it. How do they do it? Well, you know, if you go back in history, you'll remember that the Chinese, you remember what the Chinese used to do to little girls' feet? In the old days, the Chinese men had a foot fetish. They liked to see adult, beautiful women hobbling around on tiny infants' feet, deformed infants' feet, if they could possibly even hobble. And so in order to create that gorgeous, deformed foot, at birth they would take strips of cloth and they would wind it around these little girls' feet to prevent these feet from growing. And they would keep these pieces of cloth, these strips of cloth on these little girls' feet until their feet came out tiny and deformed. Well, now this is what the method does to the child. Here the child comes into the classroom, his mind, his intellect just bursting with energy, and so they take the look-say method, these long strips of cloth, and begin winding it around Johnny's brain. And they wind it and wind it and wind it until they block it. So what happens to all that energy? That learning energy, it comes out physically. It comes out in the form of physical behavior, hyperactivity. That's what happens to the Johnnies. Well, now what I've described to you is something that goes on every day in America. Every year, 3 million children enter the first grade. And it breaks my heart when I realize that 1 million of them are going to go through that process that Johnny has gone through. That they are going to be deliberately crippled, mentally crippled, intellectually crippled by a system devised to make sure that that takes place. By teachers who apparently don't know what they're doing. Either they don't know or they don't care. But the professors know. The professors know. As a matter of fact, one of the top professors of reading in America told a reporter of the New York Times when he was describing the look-say method, he said, well, we teach the children to look at a whole word so that they will see the picture. And if a child sees the word H-O-R-S-E, horse, and if that child says pony, that's okay, that's correct. Because the child is seeing something galloping. He's seeing the picture. But of course, if the child doesn't know the difference between a horse and a pony, he's in big trouble. But that's what's being told. That's what they say, without blinking an eyelash. That's the system they are using teaching children to read in America. And the results are appalling. That's the cause of functional illiteracy in America. It has nothing to do with the children. The children are perfectly fine. Perfectly fine. As a matter of fact, learning disability now is considered a handicap. These normal children. Johnny entered that school, remember, very learning able, right? Anyone who could teach himself to speak his own language is very learning able, right? 2 years in school, he's learning disabled. Interesting. You know, the Department of the federal government has become very concerned about making sure that all handicapped children get an equal educational opportunity, like, you know, normal children. And so they devised a federal program to make sure that handicapped children were given an education. Now, when they were talking about handicapped children, they meant children deaf, dumb, blind, crippled. You know, the speech impaired, the mentally retarded, the seriously emotionally disturbed, the hard of hearing and deaf, the orthopedically handicapped, the visually handicapped, multi-handicapped, deaf and blind. But you know what is now the largest single group of children in handicapped education? The learning disabled. These are perfectly normal kids who are very articulate, sometimes above average intelligence, and they are now the largest single group in special ed. As a matter of fact, and it's a growing group. In 1976, the number of learning disabled kids in these handicap programs was 796,000. In 1984, that figure was up to 1,806,000. So we're creating learning disabled kids. You know, we can't keep up with them. The schools are so successful in destroying the minds of American youngsters that, you know, they can't even keep up with them. It is now the single largest group of handicapped children under the handicap programs. A program that was devised for really handicapped children. The deaf, the dumb, the blind, the crippled. Now, the so-called learning disabled are the largest group. And in the state of California, Out of 370,000 handicapped children, do you know how many are learning disabled? 207,000 in the state of California. You've got a problem in this state. I think that Dr. Honig should address this problem. I know he's very concerned about teaching evolution. I think he ought to be concerned about teaching reading. I think it's much more important to make sure that children learn to read than know about Darwin's theory. But I haven't heard that Dr. Honig is terribly concerned about this. Now, what has this done to America? What has it done to the black community? In 1930, the illiteracy rate among urban blacks was 9.2%, which means that in 1930, over 90% of urban blacks were literate. And in 1930, when you were literate, you could read anything. There was no such thing as functional illiteracy. If you were literate, you were literate. Today, in 1984, the illiteracy rate is now 50% among blacks. Now, have blacks lost the ability to learn to read since 1930? And in 1930, what did you have? You had Jim Crow, racial discrimination, segregated schools, poor educational facilities, and yet over 90% of urban blacks were literate. Today, with affirmative action, civil rights victories, billions of federal dollars in the elementary schools, compensatory education programs like Title I and Chapter I, equal educational opportunities. What more could you possibly do in terms of money and facilities? And yet the illiteracy rate is now up to 50%. What we are doing is destroying the black community. They have become an underclass. They cannot even fit into American society. They cannot fit into our high-tech culture. They have no stake in it. They're into drugs. Teenage pregnancy is rampant among them. They are literally being destroyed by our education system. And to give you an idea of what this is doing to the blacks, how it is alienating them from the rest of society, how we are isolating them through this change in language, because they can't even speak, most of them can't even speak decent English anymore, despite the fact that they all go to school. You know, the NAACP has spent years making sure that they went to public schools. Well, now they're in public schools. But maybe you'll be interested in listening to what was said on Dan Rather's program not too long ago about what is happening to the blacks' use of language. Let me turn this on. This was a recording of a news program. It'll come on shortly.
4 centuries later. But beyond the melting pot, there is an English evolving in these United States which is incomprehensible to the majority. Bob Simon looks at what happens when the rules of grammar clash with the laws of the marketplace.
Boys and girls, we can never be back. Go hug. Don't stop. Listen to a beatbox.
A lot of street talk, a little music. That's all rapping is. Performance as communication. One way, blacks in the inner city talk to each other. One way. There are many others.
I'll say, hey, that little girl, she's fresh, man. She got a nice bumper, get her some cakes, you know. And they'll understand what I'm saying, you know.
They'll buy a pair of sneakers, right? And her would say to me, oh, that's Jordan, right? What is Jordan, right? But I know what it is. That means that the sneakers are really nice. I walk up to you and say, hey, dude, what's up?
You might not know what the meaning term of butter is, but butter also translate cocaine. I'm too cold to hold what I think in your face.
What you're hearing is not slang or dialect. It's a language with its own grammar and syntax, as native to the American ghetto as French is to France. What's new is the finding by the University of Pennsylvania that this language is traveling further and further from Standard English, deepening the divide between the ghetto and the rest of the United States.
Kicking that beat, and I never stop. I never stop.
That's a warning sign that we're heading towards a world which is divided into two camps, black and white. The isolation of that inner city population is a big problem. Economically, there are no jobs. Housing is a problem. And the language situation is reflecting that.
So we got to have our survival mechanism within our community. And our language is it. It lets us know that we're all in this thing together.
Black English English is not standard English spoken badly. Black English is revenge.
I think part of it is defiance of the society that hasn't let them in, and part of it is the sheer, desperate disadvantage of today's ghetto.
Every time any American talks about making it or getting kicks or running scared, he's talking Black English. If it came from the ghetto, words have always crossed over. But these days, there are more and more words that don't.
Man says to a dog, get out the way or I'll be done, go upside your head. Now that be done can't be translated that easily, because what it means is, just as sure as a God in heaven, I'm going to kick you out of the way if you don't get out of the way.
And here is the vicious circle. The language born in the ghetto reinforces its walls. This new language barrier creates new borders which are difficult to cross.
I have some associates that find it very difficult to work and maintain any kind of decent job because of the fact that they cannot adequately speak, so to speak, the normal language.
I'm sure that if you walked up to one of those people and explained to them that you'll put them in a wealthy position if they could correct their English, they would correct their English. Her hobbies is singing. Her hobbies are singing.
There are techniques for teaching English to foreigners, techniques which are being used in Watts today to teach English as a second language to 50,000 Black Americans, just as if they were from Poland or Puerto Rico.
What do Mama know about parties? Stuff she hasn't even done. She was trying to wrap my action, keeping me from having fun.
Before they started school, many of the black kids had never even met whites. They're learning standard English as the white man's tongue. Not better or richer than black English, but the language of the marketplace.
Verb is phrased. If you don't know how to speak proper English, they won't understand what you're saying. You won't get hired or anything like that. We're speaking about the cash language of the society. And it's a competitive society, and our children must be able to compete if they are to move into the mainstream of America.
Well, the point is very clear. They say black English is revenge. Revenge for what? For the fact that the schools have destroyed their ability to even speak their own language. He said they're now like Poles, like immigrants. They have to be taught English as if they come from a foreign country. Isn't that interesting? Blacks probably have deeper roots in America than most Americans today, because they came over, you know, many years ago. And in the 1930s, they spoke well. We've literally destroyed them. Literally destroyed them. The school system has destroyed them. And I put a great deal of blame and responsibility on black leadership that has permitted this to happen, because they have supported the public schools all of these years. They have insisted that the blacks go to the public schools. But you see, we know how to teach reading today. There's no big mystery to it. Marva Collins does it in Chicago, doesn't she? Marva Collins is that black teacher who taught in the Chicago schools for 14 years and finally left in utter disgust and frustration and created her own private school. And there she has taken youngsters who are considered uneducable by the public schools, and she's turned them into literate human beings. They read Shakespeare. They read Aristotle. They have no problem reading these things. They're being taught correctly, finally. The model is there. We know how to teach reading. It's no big mystery. Thousands of Christian schools do it every day in America. I visited a school in Anchorage, Alaska, the Harvester Christian School, which has been in existence for 16 years. And in all that time, they haven't had a single dyslexic child. You see, evolution is passing them by. It's going around them. But you see, we have the cure. We know how to teach reading, but the professors and the schools resist and resist and refuse to change. As a matter of fact, here in California, 1982, your textbook adoption committee, your state committee, chose all look-say reading programs for the elementary schools of California, guaranteeing that you will have functional illiteracy well into the 21st century in this state. This is something that Dr. Honig, I think, should address. But that's not the only problem. That's not the only problem. You see, the children in American schools are at risk in 4 ways. They're at risk academically for the reasons I've outlined to you. They're destroying their minds. They're destroying their ability to think, to read, to grow. We're creating stunted, mentally stunted human beings, crippled human beings, academically, because of the animal training techniques that are used in American schools. 30% of the children who go into American schools come out academically damaged in that way. 30% risk. Now, would you fly in an airline with a 30% failure rate? Would you buy a car from a manufacturer that produced 30% lemons? But we routinely put children in schools with a 30% failure rate, and we wonder why little Johnny comes out ruined. But then there's also the spiritual risk. Children are at risk spiritually in the schools. Why? Because the schools are doing everything in their power to undermine the religious faith of these children. How do they do it? Values clarification, death education, Dungeons and Dragons, evolution, constant barrage of anti-Christian subject matter, theory, practice. For example, in some schools, you know, they're not religious neutral. They engage in yoga, in Buddhist practices, transcendental meditation, astrology, all kinds of things in the schools. All kinds of pagan techniques are being used in the schools. And then when the children get involved with Dungeons and Dragons, that opens the door to demonism, witchcraft, wizardry, magic, Satanism. Satanism is now rampant in this country. I understand there's a lot of it in California. Children are being ritualistically murdered in this country by Satanists. There was that 2020 show that also suggested that Satanists are also practicing cannibalism in this country. Can you imagine people in this high-tech, supposedly scientifically advanced society now engaging in cannibalism? What they do is they cut out the hearts of their sacrificial victim, and then they cut it up into bite-sized chunks and pass it around, because that's what Satanists do. You know, so the Bible knows what it's talking about when it talks about man's sinful nature. John Calvin knew what he was talking about when he talked about man's innate depravity. Calvin would not have been surprised by these modern cannibals. He would have said, well, that's man's depraved nature in action, because nobody's forcing these people to become cannibals. Nobody's putting a gun to their heads telling them to do this, but they have been sucked into this whole satanic trap. And there are millions of children in America who are in danger of falling into Satanism. So you don't know what's going to happen, whether they're going to come out of the school as a nihilist, an atheist, a punker, a Satanist, or some other cultist. Take your choice. You have no idea what your child is going to come out, especially with the rock music. And of course, many of these children are led into suicide by Satanism. Death education. You know what death education does? Well, they take the kids to funeral parlors, some of the kids try out coffins. One mother told me that her daughter actually watched the mortician embalm a corpse. Isn't that a wonderful field trip? They visit cemeteries, they write obituaries, they write suicide notes, they discuss suicide at length, how to do it, when to do it, why to do it. And the result has been 6,000 teenage suicides last year. The other day, 3 teenagers in one high school in Nebraska committed suicide. Middle America, conservative America, people can't understand why their kids are committing suicide. I'd like to know how much death education those youngsters had. Oh, they're very concerned about suicide, and they get all the kids in the auditorium, and then they get all these psychologists, all these secular psychologists to tell them about suicide, how to look for symptoms, the warning signs, and all of that. It's a spiritual problem, you see. But you see, you can't address this spirit in a public school because God is kept out. God is not permitted in the public school. The true religion is not permitted in the public school. There's a wall around the public school. You see, the Constitution guarantees freedom of religion in America everywhere except in the public school. Well, of course, in a private establishment, you wouldn't expect a Buddhist to pray in a Catholic church. I mean, they're at least, it's privately owned, and private religions have a right to exclude whom they want. But a public school? You mean freedom of religion stops at the school door? What happened to freedom of religion in a public place? It doesn't exist anymore in the public schools. The Ten Commandments have been removed. In Iowa, benedictions at graduations have been, they're banned. Some atheist went to court, to the Supreme Court of Iowa, and got the state to ban benedictions because this man did not want his daughter to have to sit through 2 minutes of prayer at the last day of school at graduation. Now you must ask yourself, what kind of a man, what kind of a human being would go all the way to the Supreme Court to protect his daughter from 2 minutes of prayer at a benediction? He really thought that she'd be harmed by that little prayer. But it just shows you to what extent the atheists will go to get religion out of the schools because of their hatred of God. You see, they're not indifferent to God. They hate God. And they now are the controlling factor in public education when it comes to the spiritual. The children are also at risk morally, because who do the children meet in the public schools? The drug pushers, the drug users, the sexually promiscuous, the sexually precocious, the users of foul language. The other day somebody was complaining to me how shocked he was by what his daughter said, the kind of language that was being used in the school. She does not want to be in that high school because she does not like listening to all that profanity, that obscenity. But she has no choice if you want to be in a public school. Today, after the show, the radio show that I did earlier today, we got a telephone call from a high school student. She's a junior at Lodi High School. She was telling me what was going on there. Very few Christian students there who give out tracts. They are rejected, they are persecuted, they are, given these dirty looks. The language that she hears in school every day. I asked her, is there any Satanism in your school? She says, yes, there is some. The drug problem, I don't have to tell you about the drug problem in the public schools. I mean, you put your child in a public school and you have no guarantee he's not going to come out a drug addict. Because what have the schools become? They've become the marketplaces, the chief marketplaces for drugs in this country. Why? Because that's where the customers are. These gullible kids that are now getting on cocaine. And then the sex. You know what because teenage pregnancy now is so rampant, so epidemic, you know what the schools are now doing? The high schools are now giving out pills and condoms to the youngsters. That's their way of dealing with the sex problem. Go ahead and do it, they're saying. And now what they want to do is start teaching sex education in kindergarten. Isn't it interesting? The more sex education we teach, the worse it gets, and their solution is always to teach more sex education. I picked up this column from the Charlotte Observer when I was in Charlotte, North Carolina. Sex education curriculum faces opposition. This curriculum, this new curriculum, will start in kindergarten. And this is what they are going to teach the children in kindergarten. Objective. Pupils will be able to identify and discuss the physical characteristics of boys and girls. Suggested learning activities. Discussion using correct terminology for body parts, charts, and games. Games? What kind of games do you play in kindergarten to teach children about sex? This is getting weirder and weirder. But that's the educator's solution to the problems. You see, you can't do what you can do in a Christian school, simply tell the children that thou shalt not. It is a sin. It is wrong. They can't do that in public schools. They can't even frighten them. You see, now we've got all these diseases. Here they're giving the kids pills and condoms when they should be telling them that, have you heard of AIDS? Chlamydia, that's a new one. You know, there are new diseases coming up all the time. Chlamydia is the latest. And of course, there are the old standbys like syphilis, gonorrhea. Gee, if you only catch syphilis and gonorrhea, you're lucky, you know. There's hepatitis, there's herpes, there are warts, you name it. My God, there are so many of these diseases. And the rock music encourages sexual promiscuity. The schools are handing out pills and condoms. What protection do the children have against all of this? None whatever. And then the final risk is the physical risk, because what happens in the public schools? The children go to school with knives, chains, guns. There's a recent article in National Review in December. This is what it says. Each month, 3 million high school students are victims of crimes in school, including 2.5 million robberies and thefts. 282,000 students are assaulted in school every month. At least 125,000 teachers are threatened with physical violence each month. 1,000 teachers a month are assaulted badly enough to require medical care. 500,000 high school students say they are afraid in school most of the time. High school students are subjected to 525,000 attacks, shakedowns, and robberies every month. Well, when you consider the academic risk, the spiritual risk, the moral risk, and the physical risk, how could any parent in his right mind put his child in that kind of a school? As a matter of fact, I think there ought to be a sign on every school, public school in America saying, warning, the Surgeon General has determined that this school may be hazardous to your child's health, safety, and welfare. It's legitimate. I mean, what's more dangerous, smoking or committing suicide, becoming a drug addict? You don't know what you're going to get. The parents of America are playing Russian roulette with their children's lives in the public schools. Russian roulette. You don't know what you're going to get. You don't know if you're going to get a functional illiterate, a dyslexic, a learning disabled youngster. You don't know if you're going to get a drug addict, an atheist, a nihilist, a Satanist. You don't know if your daughter's going to get pregnant or your son catch a venereal disease or get hit over the head. As a matter of fact, the young man who was interviewing me today over the radio was telling me that his worst problem in the school he went to was assaults. Physical assaults, getting beaten up in school. That's what he was afraid of all through high school. And this is occurring in all of the cities of America. I'm not talking about only the big cities, Los Angeles, Boston, New York. I'm talking about the smallest cities, Stockton, Fresno. That's where these things are happening. So the parents of America have got to make some very, very hard choices, hard decisions. And don't expect things to get any better. I can tell you that the teachers' organizations, the NEA, the CTA, are doing nothing about those problems. Nothing. They're only going to compound them and make them worse. They are carrying out the progressive program to lead this nation into a world socialist communist system. That's their mindset. That's where they're taking us, and there's nothing that we can do to stop them. Don't expect them to even reform the teaching of reading. I have yet to see a single state in this country legislate the teaching of intensive phonics in the first grade as the only way to teach reading. I have yet to see that done. Try to get your legislature to pass that kind of a law here in California. I'd like to see how far you'll get. The CTA and the NEA will descend on that legislature and make sure it does what they want. You're not going to even reform the teaching of reading. As far as religion, I don't know why Christians put all their hope in a minute of silent prayer. They must be out of their minds. A minute of silent prayer is no substitute for a Christian education. What's a minute of silent prayer when you're giving 5 hours and 59 minutes to the devil? What kind of a exchange is that? No, you're not going to, and the humanists will not even give Christians their minute of silent prayer. You know why? Because they don't have to. They don't have to do anything. They've got you where they want you. They only want two things from you. They want your children and your money. And the Christians of America are giving them both. Well, who do you think is going to win in this battle? If the Christians keep giving the humanists and the educators what they want, who do you think is going to win? Back in the 60s, when I was writing about the Vietnam War, it dawned on me that America was doing everything wrong. And I said to myself, when you do everything wrong, you're going to lose. It's as simple as that. If you do everything wrong, you lose. And of course, we did lose. And that's what I'm telling the Christian parents of America. You're doing everything wrong. Not everything. We are creating Christian schools. But most Christian parents are supporting the public schools, putting their kids in those schools, and hoping for the best, playing Russian roulette with the lives of their children. The only solution to the problem is to remove the children from those schools. They're not going to get better, they're going to get worse. The children are in grave danger. The whole system is so rotten and corrupt that it's very difficult to imagine anything good coming out of that, even though there are many good teachers in the schools. And let me say that there are many good teachers in the schools. I got a call during the show from an administrator who was telling me that there are good teachers, they're doing everything they can, but even he admitted that he was limited in what he could do. It was a constant battle against the NEA, against the CTA, against the professors of education, a constant battle. Well, if you care about the children, then you've got to remove them from these dangerous schools and put them in private schools, church schools, or school them at home. That's the only solution. We have no other solution. And once we begin to do that, once there is a massive exodus of children from the public schools, then we can go to court and say it is unfair for Christians to be forced to pay for atheist education. After all, the atheists are not forced to pay for Christian education, so why should Christians be forced to pay for atheist education? It doesn't make sense. I mean, I have no objection to atheists having schools of their own and paying for them. Let them create their own schools and educate their children. If that man doesn't want his daughter to hear a prayer, that's fine. But why should every public school in America be turned into an atheist school to suit the atheists at the expense of the taxpayer? Why should every taxpayer in America be forced to support atheist education? Doesn't make sense. It's unfair. You see, public education is no longer viable. It's not neutral. It really has never been neutral. It never will be neutral. And we are kidding ourselves when we think that we can even reform it to become neutral. It'll never be neutral. And so Christians have some very tough decisions to make. They must make those decisions very soon, because the lives of their children are at stake. Now it will require some inconvenience. But you know, when the Founding Fathers wrote the Declaration of Independence, they put their lives on the line. We would not be enjoying the freedoms we have today if they had been unwilling to put their lives on the line. And many of those men were very comfortable. They had big homes. They were wealthy. They didn't have to do what they did. They didn't have to sign that paper that was an affront to the British Empire. But they said, we will put our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor on the line. And when that declaration was written, the King of England did not hand them their freedom on a silver platter. They had to go through 6 long years of suffering and bloodshed before they were able to fulfill that declaration and give us this nation that we have. Now, don't you think we ought to do something to save it? Don't you think it's worth saving? Don't you think you want your children to enjoy what we've had? They bequeathed us this marvelous country, and the humanists want to take it from us. We've got to stop them. The easiest way to stop them is simply get the kids out of their schools. That's their trump card, is their hold on education, their hold on the minds of our children. That's their trump card. And you still have the freedom to remove your children. You still have the freedom to create private schools and home schools. You have that freedom. You've got to exercise it. If you don't, you're going to lose everything. Well, that's what we're up against. Our founding fathers set the example. It is up to us now to follow it. Thank you very much.